Westhuizen. I'm Associate Professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela University. And I'm happy to welcome you here on behalf of CANRAD and also our co-host, the Department of History and Political Studies. So, and I'm very happy to see a number of students here from the department. You're most welcome, and we're looking forward to also hearing from you a bit later on in the program. We are gathered here today because we have our visitor here from Leipzig University, Professor Dr. Ulf Engel, and I'm very happy that he's going to be talking with us today on an area that he's been working on for a very long time, in fact, and our topic is the AU at 20. Achievements and challenges of the Pan-African project. So, and we also are very fortunate to have two respondents who are joining us. The one is from CANRAD, our director, Professor Beki Mngomezulu, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. And then also another person who's had engagements with the African Union and who we are fortunate enough to have as a colleague here at Nelson Mandela University at the Department of History and Political Studies, and that is Dikeledi Mokoena. So most welcome to both of these respondents as well, and thank you for taking the time out. So without much ado, let me introduce Professor Dr. Ulf Engel to you. Very, very good to have you here with us today, Ulf, I have to say. Thanks for making the time, and for it's your first time in Gqeberha, in fact, and second.
Yeah, I was here 25 years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, that is well, things have changed a little bit in 25 years. Yeah, just a tiny bit. Yeah, but yeah, very, very good to have you here. So, Professor Dr. Ulf Engel is a professor in politics in Africa at the Institute of African Studies at Leipzig University. He's also a visiting professor at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. And he's also a professor extraordinary in the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch here in Stellenbosch University here in South Africa. His research interests include, as we also can see from our topic today, international and regional organizations, particularly the AU, but also regional economic communities, the African peace and security architecture, and African governance architecture. He's done a lot of work on conflict prevention, early warning, preventive diplomacy, and conflict analysis. He also looks into German Africa policy. And he's also interested and written very interesting pieces on political developments in Ethiopia, with an interest also more broadly in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and also South Africa and Southern Africa. He's the editor of the Yearbook on the African Union, which is published with Brol Publisher, which is in the Netherlands and the States. 3 volumes have so far appeared since 2001. And other recent publications include as co-editor Researching the Inner Life of the African Peace and Security Architecture, which is also with Brol, that he co-edited with some colleagues. And then there's also The Finances of Regional Organizations in the Global South, Follow the Money, which came out in 2020 with Routledge. And these are just some of the more recent publications. There's a very long list of publications. So we're very fortunate to have you here with us today. Thank you for being here. And I'm looking forward. You've got about 45 minutes, and then we'll hear from our respondents after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. As I just mentioned, I've been here 25 years ago, and things have changed a little bit, I must say. Maybe before I start, as a point of disclosure, I've been working with the African Union since 2006, financed through GIZ, German Development Aid, in constructing, designing the Continental Early Warning System, working on conflict prevention, and with the panel of the WISE and other structures such as FEMWISE. So this talk today is based on some experience and insight over the last couple of years, and I will focus on just 3 points tonight. I will talk a bit about the Pan-African globalization project of the Organization of African Unity and the African Union that was founded in 2002. I will highlight 5 major achievements of the African Union and then discuss some of the contemporary challenges these institutions facing. As you can see from our corporate design, Leipzig University still is to catch up in terms of decoloniality. It seems that knowledge production, at least seen from Leipzig, is associated with white old men like myself. And we are having an interesting debate on decolonizing also our area studies. I'm working in African studies, looking very much at the debates in places like South Africa for that. Before I come to the OAU, let me share some pre-assumptions. When I'm talking about the Pan-African globalization project, this implies that globalization is not a single process. There are many globalizations with historicity and multiple agency involved, and the OAU-AU is just one of the many institutions that is developing its own globalization project. And just in a nutshell, for those who are not too familiar with that institution, the OAU was founded in 1963 with, in those days, 32 independent member states, while the continent was still struggling with apartheid, colonialism in many parts. And we've seen some major changes in the key projects that this organization was pushing. Initially, it was, as you know, about getting rid of apartheid, of colonialism, but then it was redefined in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and with the lost economic decade of the 1980s. And then we've seen another transition in 1999, leading to the establishment of the African Union in 2002. In 2013, under the chairmanship of Madame Zuma, the AU agreed on a Agenda 2063, in which the institution is defining its place in the world and what they want to achieve by 2063. Now, looking briefly at these 2 institutions and their globalization project, in more theoretical terms, this is based in historical sociology, or with an interest in institutions, past and structures, and it's influenced by 3 major dynamics. One is, of course, the internal institutional dynamic. This institution is changing over time. There are also important internal dynamics when it comes to member states, and I will talk about that later on in more detail. And of course, the global condition itself has been changing over time, and so the OAU has been trying to respond to that. And there are 3 ways that regional organizations are responding to changing global conditions. Firstly, obviously, they are trying to protect the sovereignty of their member states. They are also trying to integrate into existing globalization projects, often related to trade or security. And of course, if possible, they are trying to influence globalization processes by developing their own projects. And this is what I had in mind when looking at that timeline. I'm not going to detail this here, but when you look at the history of this institution, you will see major changes both under the OAU and under the African Union. Both of the institutions have been relaunched at least one time. So the initial aims have changed with the end of the Cold War, with Namibia becoming independent and South Africa approaching democratic elections. And the new focus was then more and more on security issues and strengthening the institution and revising some of the practices. So basically, this second change that we are looking at now started at the African Union in around 2015, and it is focusing on an institutional and financial reform I will talk about in more detail in a couple of minutes. And this is still ongoing. The institution is different from what it has been 20 years ago, and it will be interesting to see on the way to 2063 how they are implementing the current one. Just to highlight two key documents associated with the respective globalization projects. The young gentleman above is Salim Ahmed Salim, three-time Secretary General of the OAU, and he started a discussion after the end of the Cold War, repositioning the continent in a changing world. Now, this report very much talks about the changing global economics, although underlying there were other issues which are discussed by Said Jinnit and El-Qassem One in this paper recently published. Said being the chef de cabinet of Salim and the drafter of that important document, and El-Qassem One, the current chief of MINUSMA in Mali, the UN mission, was his sidekick for many years. Said then became the first Commissioner of Peace and Security of the African Union in 2003-04. Now this paper, or this report, is a very interesting assessment seen through the eyes of the OAU of global change and the need to reposition the institution and how to relate to the ongoing change. And you will find a similar document based on Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, in which the heads of state and government are describing the kind of future that they would like to see for the continent, to become a major political, social, economic force in the world with her rightful share of the global commons, an active and equal participant in global affairs, and fully capable of having the means to finance her development. And again, that is something I have to talk about later when it comes to the ongoing financial dependence of the institution. Let me quickly talk about some of the major achievements, and the list is certainly not conclusive, but I just wanted to focus on 5 points, which I will quickly talk you through, maybe focusing a bit more on the third one in more detail. So basically, the AUC, the African Union Commission, managed to cope with this transition from the OAU to the African Union. Compared to the OAU, the Commission is rather big, 1,700 people roundabout. The old secretariat of Salim, that was like 52 people, I guess. No? So you can see a huge development. It doesn't compare to, let's say, the European Union Commission, which has like 33,000 people. But you can see that increasingly after 2004, the African Union Commission has developed agency of its own. It has developed interests vis-à-vis member states, and it has been pushing a number of agendas. And it's the main legal drafting agent in this business. Member states are often not capable of drafting legal texts, lack of human resources or experience or whatever. And you will see that in many policy areas, it's either the AU Commission playing this role, or think tanks such as the Institute for Strategic Studies in Pretoria, who are doing the drafting for member states. So this AUC is, according to the AU Constitutive Act, the Secretariat of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government, and the Permanent Representatives Committee, which are the ambassadors of member states, is trying to control the AUC, but you can easily see that this got out of hand, and the balance of power has shifted over years. Right now we see a process where the permanent representatives are trying to re-establish some form of control over the Commission that they have lost in between. The second point I would like to highlight is the role of the AU in crafting legal frameworks for major policies. And here I'm looking at just two areas: peace and security and governance. And you've heard about the APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture, with the Peace and Security Council, the Panel of the Wise, the African Standby Force, the Continental Early Warning System, and the Peace Fund. This is all described in this protocol, which not just established legal frameworks, but also new institutions and new practices. And the same, in principle, should hold true for the area of democracy, elections, and governance, with an important document I will come back to later on again. So, creating new legal frameworks, institutions, interests, and norms is, of course, one of the major functions of the African Union and its Commission. The third major achievement that I see is in the area of women's rights. In preparation for the Beijing conference in 1995, there was this Kampala document that you may have heard of in 1993-4, where African women came together to prepare their position for Beijing, which then finally led to the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in October 2000. And this resolution is based on 4 pillars. The importance of women participation in peace building, protection against sexual and gender-based violence, gendered approaches to reducing fragilities, and addressing sexual exploitation and abuse by international interveners like UN peacekeeping troops. On this basis, the AU started developing further this agenda, and the Panel of the Wise came up with a report in 2014 on eliminating vulnerabilities of women and children in armed conflict, which not just talked about women as victims, but also came up with key recommendations, which were then in the following years implemented. First of all, in 2014, a special envoy of the chief of the chairperson of the Commission was appointed for the field of women, peace and security, Bineta Diop, who was or still is president of an institution called Femme Africa Solidarité. The AU launched a gender, peace and security program in 2015, and importantly came up with FemWise Africa, which is an African network of women in conflict prevention and peace mediation in 2016, leading to also the adoption of this Continental Results Framework, which is a technical document for member states to report on the progress of implementation of Resolution 1325 and national action plans in member states. So in this respect, there's lots of progress, I suppose, but at the same time, critics would, like Heidi Hudson or Cheryl Hendricks, would argue that the focus is very much on the representation of women and the conflation of constructs such as gender and women. They're also critical about violence seen through sexualized lens, and not addressing masculine cultures of violence and not tackling gender-based power relations in African institutions. So the progress is there, but still, I guess some more issues need to be addressed in more detail and more seriously. The fourth area where I see huge gains is in public health policies. You've seen the work of Africa CDC during the corona pandemic, trying to organize, coordinate and harmonize national policies, basically to buy time. In some countries it worked quite well, in others we have seen more of a problem, as we know. And again, this principle of working with the African regions, North, West, Central, East and Southern Africa, with different progress in these regions, hubs and spokes model, made some sense in terms of developing the continental health policies and systems. And this is also true for the last point I want to highlight here, the African Free Trade Agreement, which, because of Corona, was only really starting in 2021 with huge challenges in some big states such as Nigeria or South Africa, where we've seen opposition to implementing the African CFTA, but I guess some major progress has been made now, and the prospects of implementing this agreement are quite huge in terms of trade gains and putting Africa in a different position in global trade. Now that was a bit fast, maybe 5 achievements. I will take a bit more time to look at the major challenges that the African Union is facing. In 2016, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, was asked by his colleagues, heads of state and government, to come up with a report looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the institution. And this one here is taken from the summary. It's not a long report, but it's a very honest one, starting with admission that the AU has chronically failed to see through its decision. There's a crisis of implementation. It's perceived to be of very little relevance for African citizens. And if you ask yourself how much you know about the African Union and how relevant it is for your life, I guess there's a point. It's fragmented, over-dependence on partner funding, underperformance of some institutions and organs, limited managerial capacity, lack of accountability, unclear division of labor between the AU on the one hand and the regional economic communities or regional mechanisms on the other, and inefficient working methods in both the Commission and Assembly. And let me depart from this analysis and just again highlight 5 areas where the AU is struggling quite a bit. Since 1963, some 4,100 or whatever decisions have been taken by the Council, the Assembly, and the African Peace and Security Council. Few of these decisions have been properly implemented, and although there are compliance mechanisms, for instance, in the Peace and Security Council, most of them are heavily underutilized. I already mentioned the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, 2007, which went into force 2012. There is a compliance mechanism that is hugely important. Member states are supposed to report every 2 years to the chairperson of the AU Commission on progress of implementation of this democracy agenda and the domestication of its legal constructs into national legislation. So far, since 2012, we have seen only one report by 55 member states. That was in November 2017 in Togo, for whatever reason. So member states are trying to avoid their own decisions, in particular when it comes to issues of governance, and increasingly in the last 10 years, that has been the case. The second point relates to finances. There are so-called international partners, donors, with whom the AU and the member states are working with. And what you can see on this graph is the various budgets since they have been made public since 2007, and the percentage of the budget coming from AU member states and the percentage coming from donors. When we started here in 2008, 76% of the budget comes from member states, and this relation has reversed to 2018-19, where member states only contribute less than 40% of the overall budget. And as you can see in the heading, it's talking about an operational and a program budget. The operational budget is simply salaries, maintenance and all of that, rent, and this is paid by member states almost 100%, whereas program budget relates to implementation of policies, and this is paid by donors to the tune of more than 60% in recent years. There have been major reforms adopted in 2016-17, the introduction of a 0.2 levy on imports to raise additional funding for the Union, But as you can also see from the graph, after a short improvement in 2018-19, the situation has reversed again. Now, the union has decided a couple of years ago to define a 175-25 target, meaning that they want to raise 100% of the finances for the institution, the operational budget, 75% of the program budget, and 25% of the budget for AU-led peace support operations. And as you can see from this one here, the first line referring to the two recent budgets, and the dots indicate where the next two budgets have to go to if they want to meet this target. The shortfall is right now 200 million or so, and still most of the peace and security operations, but also the programs, are donor financed, and this may have implications, of course, for the independence of the institution and its position in global politics. The third point refers to what Kagame highlighted in his report, the unclear division of labor between the AU and the regional economic communities. There are 8 officially recognized RECs on the continent. What you see here on this map is overlapping membership. Some states are participating in more than one REC, some even in 4, like Kenya, and that has obviously implications for the kind of rules that you're applying in different situations, and also the division of labor. And one strong argument or point here, just for illustration, is how the RECs and the AU are responding to, let's say, coups d'etats and unconstitutional changes of government in their regions. Who's in the lead? Are there differences in approach and practices, in also the legal framework and opinion? And since this policy here is based on a memorandum of understanding that dates back to 2008, it's currently being revised, it's renegotiated. It should have been adopted this February at the summit, but has been postponed to the next one. So that is the third area where the AU is still work in progress and struggling with. And this is the fourth one I'd like to highlight, relating to so-called common positions, policies where the AU is speaking on behalf of member states, where member states have agreed to follow one course of action. In contrast to the European Union that has adopted by now 308 global common positions, the AU has done like 13 or so, and it's not quite clear from the legal side how to become a common policy and what the implications are for member states. Are they ceding sovereignty in these cases or not? The most recent ones you may have heard last year with the COP in Egypt is on climate change, a common policy, which is, I guess is tremendously important, of course. The last point I want to highlight here relates to the ambition to become a people's union. When the AU was founded or transformed from the OAU, it was said to become a people's union based on a notion of human security as opposed to regime security. Lots of expectations were raised, and there are 2 devoted institutions in the new setup, the Pan-African Parliament, which is based here in South Africa, and ECOSOC, Council for Economic, Social and Cultural Affairs, a tool for representing civil society, basically. And this cartoon from a Kenyan newspaper seems to illustrate what the real relationship between the people in others and the heads of state and government and the African people is looking like. In most places, and reflect on your own media, what's happening in others is not reported because it's not considered to be important, or it's not reaching people, and so on. Now, just to try a bit of an explanation why these challenges are still around. The elephant in the room obviously relates to issues of governance. We've seen major improvements in terms of governance over the past 60 years on the continent, and I will just illustrate that by looking at the changing nature of regimes on the continent, decade by 5 year by 5 year, looking at the percentage of military monarchies, one-party states, multi-party states. Clearly, with the end of the Cold War, we've seen this improvement going back to formal multi-party regimes. That hasn't changed much over the last years, but in substance, it has changed. And we've seen since 2019, in particular, a new wave of coup d'etats in basically West Africa, but also in Sudan. Just last year in Mali and Burkina Faso, attempted failed coup d'etats in Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, and Sao Tome. So what has changed is the level of democracy, if you want so. Now, I illustrate this with figures from Freedom House. One can be quite critical about Freedom House and the values that they're representing and the way that how they're measuring things. The advantage here is that you can build long timelines. The data is available since '72, and what this graph basically shows is that in terms of political rights and civil liberties, which is the two major baskets that they are measuring, there was considerable improvement in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The graph goes up, although at a very low level. I mean, Freedom House is looking at levels 1 to 7. Countries are either free 1 or not free 7, and you will see that the average African member states on the continent are ranging somewhere between 4.4 and 5.8, which is fairly bad scores on that index. And now in the 1990s and 2000s, this has improved slightly up to the level of score 4. Most of the regimes were considered to be partly free. And then since we've seen quite a bit of regression and backsliding related mainly to violent extremism and terrorism in many parts of the continent, but also to unconstitutional changes of government such as coup d'etats. So to sum up and conclude, this is how great cartoonists looked at the Jubilee, 50 years of OAU African Union. The right one you may have seen in one of your papers. And assuming that we are talking under Chatham House rule, I will briefly give you the take where we are today. The African Union Commission, the chairperson Faki, is in his last 2 years. He has lost all political vision. There's no leadership. Colleagues are complaining in the Commission at various levels that the leadership is failing them. At the same time, increasingly, there is a culture of denialism among member states, so you can't address issues such as unconstitutional changes of government, governance issues, backsliding in democracy or standards of democracy, and simply certain discussions are no longer held, which is quite different from, let's say, 15 years ago. So member states increasingly tend to invoke principles of national sovereignty, non-interference in each other's affairs, which is one of the fundamental principles, of course, of the OAU and the African Union. But as you also know, based on notions of human security, there was a time, a policy, when these issues were addressed, when member states were not able or not willing to protect their own people. And this increasingly, I guess, is these days is lost. Before I really come to an end, let me just, and I guess we can share the slides later if people are interested. So there's some stuff to read. There's a bit of propaganda. Christy mentioned the 3 yearbooks. I would be happy if it was already 3. We are currently finalizing number 3. But I hope that this is an interesting thing. And the books, as always, are terribly expensive, but after 2 years they are all open access. So the first volume will be open access by October, November this year. And we hope to find some money to buy immediate open access from Brill this year. But then you need to raise 10,000 euros per copy or per year to get that immediate open access, which is a bit of money. This is the last one. On the right-hand side, if you haven't been there, the Chinese building, a gift by the Chinese people. On the left-hand side, the Peace and Security building, the Julius Nyerere building, a gift by the German people. They both started building and constructing at the same time. The Chinese were 5 years faster than the Germans because the Germans underestimated that they were building on a swamp. The whole compound is the former high-security prison of Addis Ababa, and a gift again by the Ethiopian government to the African Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Dr. Ulf Engel. I think we will agree that that was a very comprehensive oversight, not oversight, overview rather is the correct word, overview of the African Union, really drilling into various dimensions of the organization, historically, structurally, the questions of around funding, the question of the implementation of decisions. I can already see that we've got a lot to chew on. And then, of course, also a critical analysis pointing out particular shortcomings, in the institution, and I'm also looking forward to us taking that up and talking further and trying to make sense of the reasons for that with Professor Dr. Ulf. So our next speaker is Professor Bheki Mngomezulu. He's a full professor of political science and international relations. He has recently joined Nelson Mandela University, actually as director at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, coming to us from UWC, where he was Deputy Dean of Research. He holds 7 academic qualifications from 3 South African universities and 2 from Rice University in Texas in the United States. He's been a visiting professor at universities in Romania and Sweden. And he's got several books out, including The President for Life Pandemic in Africa, published in 2013, and then Foreign Policy Posture in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Consistencies and Ambiguities. Okay, that came out in 2020. So without further ado, please do join us. This is our first respondent, Professor Mngomezulu, and he will be speaking to us for 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, colleagues, those of you who are here and those who are joining us virtually. Prof, when I saw this picture, I was reminded of my trip to Addis Ababa in 2006, but I lost my picture, so when you go back there, I'll ask you to look for it. You know what happens when you are invited to be the best man? You must try not to overdress to the extent that people can't tell who is the groom. So for that reason, I'm not going to use this PowerPoint. I decided deliberately not to do that. So I'll be reading from my notes, and then if Prof. Van Westhuizen agrees, then she can share these notes with you. In the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase. There is a direct link amongst 3 concepts from the presentation by Prof. Engel. The first one is Pan-Africanism, the second one is AU, and OAU, and then the third one, of course, is the AU. The common denominator among these concepts is that they were all put together with one intention. They were geared towards finding an African identity, and making Africa a player in the global scale. Although some scholars credit Kwame Nkrumah, that is the first president of, or the president of Ghana, the reality of the matter is that nationalism, the history of nationalism dates far back than the days of Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence. And therefore, one has to go far back than the 1957 when Ghana became a democracy. Beginning with the establishment of the OAU on the 25th of May 1963, which is normally referred to as Africa Month, Prof. Engel traces the history of the African Union. Throughout his presentation, he makes an indefatigable effort to consider both the achievements and also some challenges, which I normally refer to as failures. I put it in blunt terms, failures, African failures, and I'll explain why I use that concept. This paper is important in reminding us as a continent about the road we have traveled and explains why we have not reached the goal that we envisaged in 1963 when the OAU was established. And then in terms of the main issues, I'm not going to repeat what Prof. Engel has already said, but in summary, he looks at 4 observations. The first one is a reflection on the history of the OAU, which then subsequently became the AU, and related developments in that regard. And then secondly, he looks at the theory of change, focusing on 3 areas, that is the global context or global conditions, internal dynamics, and then of course institutional dynamics. So this is a simpler way of explaining how the theory of change operates, looking at those 3 localities. Then the last part one is to look at the role of regional organizations, and then the last one, of course, are the key documents that he referred to be exact. And the second thing that Prof. Engels does in this paper basically is to enumerate 5 achievements of the AU. One being that of managing transformation and developing agency, in which case then he makes reference to the AU Commission, which Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, our very own, had a privilege to lead. And then, of course, the second one is the adoption of sound legal framework, which speaks to peace and security as well as democracy. And in this regard, he cites the 2002 Durban Protocol, which is when the OAU was formally changed or transformed into the African Union in Durban. And then the third one is pushing for women's rights, in which case then he cites the 2003 Maputo Protocol. And then the last part one is coordinating sound public health policies, in which case he makes reference to the Africa CDC during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then the last one is kicking off the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which then, of course, was formed in July 2019. Then the last bit looks at some of the challenges that the continent is contending with. One of them is drawn from Paul Kagame's 2017 report, which focuses on lack of implementation. In other words, the African continent is struggling when it comes to implementation, and he even gave a figure of 4,100 decisions being taken, but then, of course, the continent still lagging behind in terms of implementing those decisions, which is the same thing we could say about our own government, whereby we make a number of decisions, but then when it comes to implementation, is something totally different. Then the second one is establishing independent finances. We are solely dependent on foreign funders. And then, of course, they say the one who is basically the piper, who pays the piper, is the one who calls the tune. In other words, once I give you money, then I should dictate to you what you should do with that money, which is exactly the reason why the late Mugabe became notorious, because he didn't want to go to the IMF and the World Bank borrowing money. And then the West was not pleased. And then they painted him in a negative manner, and then until he died. And then, of course, you know what happened to Libyan Colonel Gaddafi. Because he was using some of the money that accrued from oil sales to basically improve the lives of his own people, then they eliminated him under false pretense. But that's a discussion for another day. The other point that Prof. Engel makes is that It looks at clarifying these roles between the AU and the regional blocks, or regional economic commissions, as he puts it. And then the last part one is developing common global positions. And then the last one, becoming a people's union, in which case he cites PAP, not PAP and Fleece. PAP, that is the Pan-African Parliament, and then, of course, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. So in summary, those are the key points that Prof. Engel makes. Then, as I come towards the close, I've made 5 observations. The first one, in other words, providing the broader context within which this presentation should be understood. The first one is that the current political leadership in the African continent is different from the nationalist leaders of yesteryears. Their priorities are not exactly the same as those of the nationalists who brought freedom to the African continent. The difference is very clear. With regards to the nationalist leaders, they put people first, and whatever they did it as a sacrifice. The caliber of leaders that we have today, they focus more, they invest their energies on egotism, which is geared towards self-aggrandizement. They are mostly concerned about themselves. The order is totally wrong. It's me, myself, and I. Then everybody else can eat the crumbles. Whereas those who came before, they were focusing on the people and the people only. The second observation is that the AU's failures, and mind you, I'm not saying challenges, the AU's failures are mainly caused by neocolonialism and the continental, on the continent, and then, of course, a number of issues that have divided the continent. What I refer to as the compartmentalization of the continent into Anglophone states, those that were colonized by England, Francophone states, those that were colonized by France, and then Lusophone states, those that were colonized by Portugal. Interestingly, Pan-African Parliament, as Prof. Engel said, is based in Johannesburg here in South Africa. And some of you watched with a keen interest when some of our colleagues from West Africa were saying that the headquarters of the Pan-African Parliament should be moved away from South Africa and they should go to France. Then I said, we really have a problem in Africa. If we have leaders who reside in Africa, but their minds and their emotions and their everything resides in France. So there is an identity crisis there. And then the other point is, of course, that creating the Pan-African Parliament was a noble idea. However, its effectiveness has been hindered by what I call a trust deficit. Our African leaders don't trust one another, which is why they even sell one another to the Westerners. That is one of the realities. Then the last part one is that without taking agency away from Africa, some of the AU's challenges and failures are in fact caused by the international community. At one point, I made a professor in America upset when she asked me a question, Peggy, when are these civil wars going to end in Africa? For a moment, I didn't respond because I was just trying to keep my cool. Then when I gained my strength, I said they would stop as soon as we stop funding them. And she kept quiet until I came back into the country. And the reason I was saying that was very simple. If you look at the war in Angola, Jonas Savimbi was able to face government from 1975 until he was killed in 2002. Then you ask yourself the question, where did he get the money? And if you look at the case of Mozambique, Alfonso Dhlakama did the same thing, 1975, and he was fighting Frelimo all the way. Where did he get funding? And then if you look at the status in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, people in the Niger Delta are still suffering to this day. And then funding is coming from all over directions to sustain those who are fighting government. Obviously, then it means that for as long as the West is supporting these criminal activities, we're not going to be out of the woods. And then the last point is that for the African continent to move with a speed and to significantly reduce some of the challenges highlighted by Prof. Engel in his presentation, there is a need for self-introspection first, then there is a need for bravery, there is a need for honesty, there is a need for vision, and of course, trust building, given that we have a trust deficit in the continent. In conclusion, Prof. Engel has prompted us as Africans and African scholars to reflect on the road Africa has traveled since 1963 when the OAU was formed, he has implicitly implored us to look at the causal factors that are delaying us from implementing some of the AU decisions that we have taken over the years. And then, of course, explaining some of the current situations we find ourselves in. Such an analysis has given us a lot to ruminate about as we work towards reconfiguring Africa's identity in the globalizing world. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Prof. Ngomezulu. I think that we're moving in the direction of a strong debate here, and it is. I think that Prof. Ngomezulu has got a point in terms of perhaps also naming things, you know, by their name in a sense when we're talking about what he calls failures also. So I'm looking forward to our audience engaging with us. I also want to tell our online audience that are joining us via Facebook and YouTube, as we've said in the chat function, please post your questions, your comments, and those will be relayed here via our fantastic Nhlakanipho Mkhlangu. She will read your question out loud or your comment out loud, so we will be able to actually engage with it. So please do send us your comments via the chat function, either on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you might find yourself. And now for our next respondent, Ms. Dikeledi Mokoena. She's an associate lecturer here at the Department of History and Political Studies. She holds a number of degrees, BA and honors and MA from Wits University, and a certificate in African political economy from UNISA. She is currently, it seems to me she's due to graduate soon with her doctorate from the University of Pretoria in political science. Her pedagogical approach, she says, is shaped by Afrocentricity, decoloniality, and feminism. She has 7 years of lecturing experience, and she was a facilitator for 9 years and a researcher for 11 years. To date, Ms. Mokoena has trained almost 2,000 young leaders from 55 African states, focusing specifically on Pan-Africanism, intersectional leadership, and governance. And I think we're very fortunate to have her here with us today because she's also consulted specifically for the African Union on questions of gender. So please join us here in front, and you've got 10 minutes, and looking forward to hearing from you, Dikeledi.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Prof, for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I think it's wonderful when somebody is celebrating their birthday and we get to say all the wonderful things they have done. And I think also when the wonderful people who love that individual, they may be as honest about the needs for them to also grow, points of growth and points of reflection that is basically highlighting where the shortfalls are. And I think Prof. Ulf has actually done that for us today, which is quite sort of important. So I think what I'm going to do is somewhat start with you know, my thoughts basically when particularly looking at the topic itself. And I thought, you know, perhaps maybe let me start by being an academic and actually sort of invite us to also then think about even the concept of Pan-Africanism in the context of globalization, because that in itself is quite problematic, has its own challenges and issues as well that we should not sort of take for granted, right? So there have been obviously different conceptualizations of what you know, Pan-Africanism actually is. From the very beginning, it was largely sort of the way in which it was defined was centered on it as a movement for the end of slavery, right, and colonization. So, I mean, you know, this critique falls perfectly within, or rather, please allow me to read from this. So yeah, so it's basically sort of, I'm inviting us to do a conceptual critique, right, of this particular beautiful and interesting topic of Pan-African globalization. And I'm hoping that Prof at some point will also speak to this. you know, Nigerian scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, when he explained globalization, I mean, he explained to us and reminded us that it's not something new, right? So globalization literally has been in existence and taking place since the beginning of capital, for that matter, for the formation of capital. And how we encountered it as African, and Africans has largely been through colonization and enslavement, but predominantly, more significantly with colonization. So that's how we became integrated in the world. That's how we were globalized into the global world economy. And I think the remnants of that we continue to feel that. And a part of the reason, part of the purpose rather, of the African Union, particularly if you look at what's this aspiration number 2, right, of the African Union, is to actually build the kind of Africa which is self-reliant, right, which is basically premised on the idea of the African Renaissance. And the African Renaissance is also premised on this idea of an independent Africa that's able to determine itself culturally, politically, economically. And so far, is that the case in the African continent? Not necessarily so. I think that kind of sort of political orientation, I mean, it is great that we have been advancing democracy and all of that. I fully applaud. And I think the African Union has literally been trying, in a sense, irrespective of the challenges that we've been facing, particularly with, as Prof mentioned earlier, with unconstitutional changes of government. But what we need to be critical of is also the nature of the political, sort of ideological, right, orientation of democracy itself, particularly in the African continent. Is the kind of democracy that we have been advancing really suitable for the material conditions that Africa finds itself in? So liberal, market-centered democracy, that is certainly not working for us. And I think those are conversations that the AU also need to really be deeply engaging in. So politically, if we are talking about independence, African Renaissance, what does politically democracy mean? Ideologically, what does it mean? So this renewal, this renaissance should actually make sure, or rather inform us really to really go back and thinking about in the context of governance. So what does it really look like for us in reshaping what we need to reshape? And that's the nature of democracy that we have. Economically as well. I think a lot of African states, African economies, you know, are working towards, again, market-centered economic growth. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right now, particularly when you look at the documents that have been released in relation to, you know, the Secretariat, right, what it has been promised. I mean, it's great that we are going to have a lot of the private sector, you know, advancing and pushing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But that in itself, on its own, should also begin to show us ideological orientation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, so where it is leaning. And I think that's something that also we need to be mindful and critical of. So what is a market-centered African Continental Free Trade? You know, is that fundamentally in relation to what the OAU, I mean, the fact that the OAU had to transition to an AU, and a part of that had been, you know, create an institution which is linked to the people, right? That it is about the people and the masses. So if we are then sort of interpreting Abuja Treaty, the 1991, in the way that we are interpreting it now, which is market-centered trade, I mean, continental trade, area, then we also need to really be mindful of that particular thing. So I think this is also just highlighting that critique. And then Prof also mentioned, you know, the finance crisis. So certainly, I think a lot of people are very concerned about that. But I think the East African community is doing quite well in terms of the financing aspect. And I think that's a model as a regional economic community. That's a model that the AU could also sort of try to mimic. So the East African community is literally just made up of relatively small countries, unequal in terms of the economic sizes. However, there is an expectation for all of them to contribute the same amount of money to making that institution actually run. And I think that's a very impressive model to actually try and emulate. I'm not sure where the 250 million, you know, where we could get that as a continent. But I think, and for making sure that member states are committed to funding and actually paying the dues, that is something really that, and I think there have been other individuals as well who've suggested other levies in contribution. I think there's one that's related to aviation, if I'm not mistaken, that was suggested at some point. But that's something perhaps, hopefully, audience and everyone else can verify. But I think there have been suggestions around how we can self-finance, right? How we can finance. And Prof is certainly was right, because this is actually has implication for ourselves, this sense of independence, the sense of this African Renaissance, right? The African Renaissance that is premised on our ability to determine our fate, our ability to actually control our own affairs. Yeah, so, and then with regards to, maybe let me just also a bit slightly comment on the, I guess, yes. When there appears, or certain individuals in the African Union who do not comment on, you know, the mess that their peers are doing in their own countries, well, certainly that is a problem. But I think for some reason, you know, that seems to be confused. I don't know if it's confusion or whatever, but it's linked to this idea of sovereignty, respecting the sovereign position of the various member states, but certainly that is not assisting us in any way. And I think it is important to make those voices, as I think Prof. Was highlighting. The other beautiful part, though, is particularly in relation to the crisis of governance that we've been seeing, particularly with the coups and the military coups that have been surging in the continent. I know last year the African Union made its year. The theme, the theme was an unconstitutional changes of government, and the African peer review mechanism was mandated to also do research, collect data, and actually write on that. So they've done that. I know this year in January, February, African member states were discussing that high-level report as well. So interestingly, that particular report, and as much as we're doing great, as Prof mentioned, in terms of the things to celebrate about the African Union, would be our position on gender, right, and women's rights. But it's seemingly, and with this specific report, this year's report on unconstitutional changes of government, it was actually silent on gender, right, which is quite fascinating and problematic. But luckily, certain individuals, including myself, we were given the opportunity to write and sort of something on, add on to that report. So something was then at least add a sort of a gender dimension. But the fact that we had to do this post the actual data being collected and analyzed and the actual final report, you know, being written, and then we're like, oh, you know, as an afterthought, you forgot gender. I mean, that's quite problematic. So in a sense, I think we can still link it to that critique that you made, Prof, when you said that in as much as, yes, there's all these amazing programs and also other units as well that are, you know, apart from the policies and the protocols that really advance women's rights, but we also need to deal with the patriarchal culture and consciousness. And I think that's also what has been informed the silencing of issues of gender and women's experiences of UCG, that's unconstitutional changes of government in the African continent. So, and then I just, yeah, so that was, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to add. Yeah, with regards to ECOSOC, I will not mention much, I think POP is a thing. And we've seen really other theatrics that are very disappointing in that space. But I think comparatively, it is a good institution, so I'm not gonna really to say anything more about it. I'll just speak to one that affects us, or that at least we can directly have influence on, and it's ECOSOC. I think even ECOSOC as well, I mean, they're doing amazing work, but then at the same time, we need to also be mindful of representation. So a lot of the organizations, the civil society organizations that form part of that have to be endorsed and recognized by the state. So now in cases where, you know, say a particular government is not really supportive of certain views that are, you know, espoused by a particular, so now even with those who make it into that space, the fact that member states also have to then make the decisions, it really is, we really need to be critical of that, and I think that's something that we need to really take, take to heart and challenge, because then it means that those who are actually given voice at that level are those who actually speak a similar tune to what the states are. This is not to take away from the work, the wonderful work that, you know, all the other CSOs, whatever it is that they're doing with ECOSOC. We know they're doing amazing work. But at the same time, we need to also be mindful of the critique and the shortfalls that come with being endorsed by the state. In that sense, for you to actually have a voice in that particular avenue. So I think, yeah, in that sense, I will leave it at that. I had like 2 pages written down, but I did not read it for some reason. And yeah, I'd really like to thank Prof for your presentation. And then, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot. Can I ask our speakers to please gather in the front and so that we can engage now with our audience. So please grab a chair here at the front panel. And we do have some water here as well, if you need a splash of water just to wet the throat. Okay. I think it's a bit crowded here, so I'm going to stand on the side, and that will also allow me to see, you know, to better engage with our audience as well. So. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to Dikeledi for that last input. And I have to say we've been doing extremely well in terms of time. So I want to suggest that we first just have our speakers engaging with one another briefly. And I'd love to hear from Professor Dr. Engel in terms of a response to our respondents. Any thoughts that you want to share with us at this stage?
Maybe just one. Should be working, yeah. Just what came to mind was in many of the important points that you raised, the role of South Africa in that. When the UN Security Council voted for the no-flight zone in Libya, what did South Africa do? They supported the resolution. South Africa plays an important role when it comes to finances. It's bankrolling the African Union. They are shouldering like 9% of the overall budget. What is the position on APIM and UCGs and all of that? South Africa is not reporting, it's not complying. You've seen the APRM reports on this country and the way that they were discussed. That's an important issue that just came to my mind when you talked about that. Other than that, also on the issue of gender, the notions of gender and women policies in the African Union are based on the kind of feminism that was around in the early 70s. The ladies who were socialized up by now 75, 80 years old, and they are still running the show. So it's important that young people get a chance to add and change the dynamics at the African Union. And I guess an important addition to that has been FemWise at the beginning, although FemWise lost lots of its dynamics and move. And many people are quite unhappy with that, and there's a crisis of expectation around FemWise. And so donor support is now being withdrawn, and they're rather going to support regional or nation-state-based processes. I guess the African Union is at a critical juncture right now because of the lack of leadership, and the environment isn't becoming better or more friendly for the AU. But we will come back to that, I suppose.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to Ulf's comments about gender, Dikeledi?
I mean, I do agree. I do agree. I think although I know the African Union now, there is an attempt to have these programs where there are somewhat training and incorporating younger voices, particularly women's voices. But in terms of the real decision, sort of the decision making and those particular powers, we are not even seeing that. I think even with the the African Union Youth Envoy. I know the first one, I remember in my observation of that, and particularly in a lot of the beautiful, really difficult work that I was doing, you also would see the drowning of the youth voice in that sense, and that particular drowning of the youth voice in the context of really the elderly and a lot of patriarchal. And what is interesting about anything youth related at the AU is there's always older people who are the keynote speakers. It is the old people who are like driving things and all of that. The current AU envoy, I think she's been different in a sense, but in terms of the influence, I think that's something that perhaps our students here should really work on studying, right? So what has been the effectiveness of sort of the youth envoy within the AU, and try and see in terms of other decision making. So what has been the experience, and there's a lot. I know Aya was here last month, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a research opportunity for our students. I'm hoping that perhaps maybe they could look into both of the youth envoys female, which is also quite amazing. But nonetheless, it is problematic that we do have really older people. And I think the current sort of more contemporary feminism tends to be very scary to the older elephants at the African Union. For instance, the fact that issues on sexuality continue to be marginalized, right? You look at AU documents, you'll see everything amazing and beautiful about gender equality, women and children, but really nothing on sexuality. And I think that we cannot really take for granted in terms of intersectional feminism, right? That particular silence is very problematic, because that particular silence has also resulted in what we are seeing in Uganda today. We are seeing it in so many other contexts whereby the human rights of so many Africans are, violated on the basis of their sexuality, and that is reflective of the kind of feminism that is, somewhat different from back then and what we have today. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And any thoughts on South Africa particularly?
Sure, thank you for
that was really like an elephant in the
Prof
room.
is embarrassing us, like showing us, like what is airing our dirty laundry, really embarrassing stuff there. I don't want to say anything. I will leave it to Prof to respond to that one. But I think it was quite embarrassing. What South Africa did, and then considering the consequences as well of that particular decision.
You're talking about the airspace decision.
The Libya decision, and I think also regarding the fact that we're also not reporting on this particular matter, and considering our own security challenges in the continent, right? I mean, in South Africa in relation to our fellow Africans. So in that sense, there's a lot of work that really needs to be done. And I think maybe if just to link it back to that, and I think this is also what the African Union seeks to do, right? It seeks to sort of invite ordinary Africans to participate in it as well. And maybe this is also the work that we can also take on as ordinary Africans, as ordinary South Africans. How then do we deal with some of the challenges that we know our country is facing, and then what can our roles be in that particular context? Maybe that's a conversation for the younger generations to have as well. But I'll keep it there. So Prof must just answer that one.
Okay, Becky, I think you'll have to grasp the nettle, as I say.
Maybe let me start off with this youth issue. There is a phrase I like which the youth has adopted: nothing about us without us. I like that one, because the problem is that we have elderly people who have absolutely nothing more to offer. They did well at some point, but they have nothing more to offer. But they're gripping on power indefinitely. In fact, the book that I wrote that you referred to, Prof., The President for Life Pandemic in Africa, was speaking to those issues. There are people who want to be presidents until they die in office. Some of them can hardly walk, but they still want to be in office. On the issue of South Africa, I think South Africa is pressed between the rock and the hard place. On the one hand, we want to do things the way we want to, at times following our foreign policy agenda, including the issue of Vladimir Putin, which has kept me very busy the whole week. Yesterday and today, I woke up at 4 because my interviews with the media were starting at 5 a.m. And then even before coming here, I was with Channel Africa on the same issue. The problem with South Africa is that there are certain things that we want to do. But then the moment we do those things, we are being ostracized by our fellow Africans. That is the first dilemma. I know this for a fact because at some point when I was in a country which I will not mention, here in Africa, somebody was saying that South Africa is trying to be Africa's America. Because the kinds of things that we do, given our financial muscle, and then they say we want to dominate. And they are saying that we are the latecomer when it comes to democratic dispensation, which is true. And then they say we want to jump the queue and then want to have the loudest voice. So that is the problem we're facing. On the Libyan crisis, Africans are equally to blame for the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. Because Muammar Gaddafi was not killed, he was assassinated. There is a difference. Uncle Google will answer that question. What's the difference between killing and assassinating? So Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated because under international law, when you apprehend someone during a war, you grab that person changes their identity, then becomes a prisoner of war. But in this case, Muammar Gaddafi was caught alive, but then he had a bullet shot through his skull because they wanted to send a message. And the reason why I'm saying Africans in general and South Africa in particular are to blame for that is because the AU took long to take a firm decision. And the reason goes back to the point I made earlier on. We are not united as a continent. We still see ourselves as the French people living in Africa, the British living in Africa, the Portuguese living in Africa. So we have an identity crisis. And as a result, we cannot speak in one voice. So when then South Africa wants to make a statement saying that let us do things this way, they say we are trying to be Africa's America, want to dominate us. And that is partly the reason why South Africa ended up voting affirmatively that there should be a no-fly zone in Libya, which was a disaster, both for South Africa and for Africa as a continent. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to throw this open now to our audience. We have a roaming mic here, and that Nhlakanipo has with her. Right here. Right over here. Great. Please tell us who you are before you ask your question or make your comment. Good.
Gary Prevost, Research Associate in History and Political Studies. Question for Nicoletti. Could you give us an executive summary of that addition you have made to the report on the unconstitutionality? Because I'm just curious what the gender dimension to that is, and if you could just give an executive summary of what you have added to it, that would be interesting to me, and I hope to others.
Okay.
Thanks. Let's take a few more questions. Right at the back there. Tell us who you are before you ask a question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I am Zukisa Sikoko. I'm a politics student, honors. No, I want to ask a question, a sort of clarity to Prof. Mngomezulu about the comments about the building of trust in Africa. I want to ask, where do we draw the line that now we can't associate with you? We have done enough, respond and answer for your actions. I'm asking this in the context of African leaders suppressing opposition and violating human rights. So if we are going to allow a situation where dictators are trusting and protecting each other, where does it put us as ordinary people? Thank you.
Good question, that. And over here, Johnny D. I'm referring to your cap. But you can tell us if your name is Johnny D or
No, thank you very much. My name is Elijah, and I'm a third year in political studies. My question is around the context of, African Union. What is it saying, or what is their view with regards to the with the president of Zimbabwe? I'm seeing here it's also part of the 55 member states. And what is the view of his dictatorship in terms of what is happening in Zimbabwe right now? Because it's democratic, as we can put it, but not entirely based on how the citizens of Zimbabwe are being treated in that side. So what is the African Union's view, and what is it saying with regards to that? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to tag along on that last question, and of course, those who have not watched the documentary that's currently being aired on Al Jazeera should hurry and do so. This is the result of years of investigative work that actually shows how the Zimbabwean government has been using gold as part of a money laundering scheme. And I would, on that note, want to also ask our panel to please weigh in on how the Zimbabwean government has been managing the political and economic crisis in that country, also in light of these latest revelations. Ulf, shall we start with you?
Thank you, Christine. And thank you for the question on Zimbabwe.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for the question on Zimbabwe. The AU has pronounced itself only once on Zimbabwe in 2008. So there is no AU position on what's happening in Zim, as there is no position on what's happening in South Africa. So when we look at that, we have to understand that the African Union is not a unitary body. There are many voices within the African Union, many institutions that can address a situation like that, and neither Zim nor South Africa nor whatever is now on the agenda of the African Union in terms of the Peace and Security Council or the Assembly and Council meeting that we have had in February. I guess part of the explanation is that there are a number of countries who never make it to the agenda, big countries, or countries who are influential or have been influential in the past. Zimbabwe has been an important country dominating defining the OAU's agenda when it comes to fighting apartheid and supporting the liberation struggles. That is not forgotten with many people. And then there are other countries like Algeria, Egypt, or others who are too big to be named. So they are looking away, basically.
Thank you very much. I'll have a quick one on Zimbabwe, and then I'll answer the question directed to me. The story of Zimbabwe is a sad story. It's a sad story in the sense that we were made to believe that when President Emmerson Mnangagwa assumed office, then suddenly things will change for the better. I became notorious when I was asked questions about the future of Zimbabwe under President Emmerson Mnangagwa. I was pessimistic then as I'm pessimistic now. The reason was very simple. Emmerson Mnangagwa was part of the Zimbabwean political leadership. And in fact, he met Mugabe in 1952, long before Zimbabwe became independent in 1980. They were working together. And then all of a sudden, he talks about what he calls the new dawn. The question is, where will the new dawn come from? You are coming from the same political party, you have been eating from the same plate with the same man, and then suddenly you are coming with the new dawn. Unfortunately, the same narrative also found its way here in South Africa. Our own president, Cyril Ramaphosa, he made the same statement. He went to Davos, he talked about 9 wasted years. The question is, where were you? Were you in a coma? Did you just resurrect now? So basically, those are some of both leaders. And luckily, I've just written a piece I will share with you, Prof. Van der Westhuizen. So I've written a piece where I'm doing a comparative analysis of the two leaders. That is our own President Ramaphosa and then President Emerson Mnangagwa, especially on the issue of the so-called New Dawn. That is, Zimbabwe is worse off now than it was under Mugabe, when you look at the economic situation and the political situation. And I was with SAPC just 2 weeks ago, talking about South Africa, asking them a question. Look at the crime statistics, look at the unemployment rate, look at the stage of load shedding, and ask yourself the question, are we better off now than we were before the president took over? Then you be the judge. Now, on this question by Uzugisa, on this trust deficit, in fact, in 2018, I presented a paper at Chuka University in Kenya, where I was saying trust deficit is the main reason why the continent of Africa is not developing. African leaders don't trust one another. And there are many reasons for that. One of them is one I highlighted earlier on, because there are those who still subscribe to France, others to Britain, others to Portugal. So you have those differences. Then the second one, we have ethnic differences. Then, of course, within a particular country, we'll have those different political parties, which in the main don't differ in terms of ideologies. If you take three political parties, any three political parties, and ask your question, what is the ideological difference among these political parties? There is none. The reason why they are forming these parties is simply because they want to amass power. And then once they have that power, then they're going to take as much as possible from you and I, not because they want to give something to you. So trust deficit, therefore, has a number of causal factors and has a number of origins, including the ones I've just referred to. Then, in conclusion, you recall that when President Mandela assumed office in South Africa, there was a crisis in Nigeria. And then what happened when Sani Abacha was doing the kinds of things that he was doing? You know, the fate of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni Nine. Mandela is one person in Africa who came out openly and said Nigeria must be ostracized. He went on to say Nigeria must be kicked out of the Commonwealth. How did African leaders respond? They said, no, this guy has been in prison for too long. He doesn't understand that we in Africa, we don't turn our backs against some of our own. And that is basically one explanation why we're where we are right now. So if you want to say the right things, then you'll be ostracized. You want to make a lot of political rhetoric, then you'll be the hero. That is the problem we're facing. Thanks.
Thank you. Some straight talking. Dikeledi, do you want to respond to the question that was posed to you?
Yeah. In 1963, when just before the OAU was formed, there were two camps as to what should happen in the continent. Camp number one was led by Kwame Nkrumah, who basically believed that we should unite there and then because of his analysis of what was happening in other parts of the world, particularly Latin America. So he had argued that it is important for us to politically unite, that basically have the United States of Africa, and that way that is how we'll be able to deal with the economic challenges that we have as a continent. And then you then have the other camp, which is basically my in-laws, Mwalimu Nyerere. Basically, that particular camp was more of a gradual unification of the continent, right? So basically, and obviously the camp that won became what we have today, which is basically a gradual approach to continental unity. And then which then obviously then resulted in what we're seeing today, regional economic communities, the African Union, which is still trying to actually come together and all of that. One of the critique that was highlighted by Nkrumah at the time, or Sajafo Kwame Nkrumah, was that if we fail to address our issues at this particular moment, it will be our own people who are going to rise up against us one day, because we are going to fail to meet the economic conditions, or the economic needs to change their material conditions that they live in. And that is essentially what is currently happening today. I think it is quite easy a lot of the times also to then particularly with concepts of, or how we label certain leaders, right, particularly in the African continent, and sort of those labels also then obviously are then not really neutral, let's put it that way, largely because some of them do come from outside in terms of how we define and see and analyze what is happening in the African continent. And I think that's also linked to the challenge of, that's what you were responding to, Prof, is that what we've been taught in the African continent, particularly in terms of political science, has largely been the kind of political science that studies individuals and not necessarily systems and institutions. So when we are stuck in analyzing individuals, and we think in political science in terms of individuals and leadership at individual level, we are missing the institutional, structural, and systematic issues that will continue even if we even if we change leadership, right? Even if we were to get the most progressive leader to lead any African country, as long as we do not deal with the institutional, structural, systematic issues, those people will also fail. Those people will also become failures. Those people are most likely, some of them, in the attempt to respond to those challenges, some of them might end up being declared dictators as well. So I think this is where also sort of the conversations, particularly for us in the African continent, we need to then begin to reinvest and shift our energy in terms of what we then consider conversations and studies or topics worth studying and analyzing, particularly in the context of political science. So, I mean, I've been very ignorant of what is happening in the media. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on the Zimbabwe situation. So I'll just keep it, I'll just allow what has been said, but it's homework for me. I'm definitely going to watch the Al Jazeera documentary you've mentioned, and also just follow what is happening in Zimbabwe. But generally speaking about the Zimbabwean situation, I think institutional weakness has enabled a whole lot of challenges that we are seeing in Zimbabwe today. And those institutional changes are not unique, certainly, to not Zimbabwe. They're not unique to Zimbabwe. We are seeing weak institutions throughout the continent. I think also in certain instances, particularly, I mean, there are threats of actually also our own institutions really going into tatters in our own country. And I think that's also something that needs to be responded to. If we were to even imagine any form of change and transformation in the continent, particularly in relation to the economy and governance, we need to really strengthen that we have, which I know that obviously does not take away from the importance of, again, reimagining and the ideological work that needs to happen in terms of, you know, what kind of institutions do we want to build and the nature thereof. So
can I pause you there?
Yes.
And then, because we are running out of time, but thank you so much for that. I want to bring us our audience in just for one final brief round, and also just to hear from Tlakanipo if we've got any online questions or comments. I think let's go to our online audience first. Thanks, Tlakanipo.
Humelo Sitonga says, thank you, Prof. Engel. A comprehensive presentation indeed. Our continent constitutes about 20% of the global landmass, with about 16% of the global population residing in Africa. Yet we attract a paltry of 4% of foreign direct investment, with massive youth unemployment and unemployability due to a dearth of skills, widespread corruption, lack of infrastructure, and other social ills. What are the mechanisms in place, perhaps through structures like ECOSOC, to address these challenges as we journey towards 2063? Great. Is that it? Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that. Then a last brief question from the floor. Now we've got a whole lot of questions. I think let's keep it brief, but I do want to take all of them. So, Batlalifi, and then the gentleman at the back there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Molantelo. I'm also a student in the political science department. So my question is to Prof. Engels. I just wanted to ask if the African Union can be a neutral arbiter of peace in the war between Russia and Ukraine, because at the end of the day, that war, excuse me, that war is affecting us as Africans due to everything going up, the rising cost in products and exports and imports. So I just wanted to know if, or what is the stance of the African Union with regards to that war. Thank you so much.
Great, and then Butler Leafy.
Thanks for that. I like the picture that was standing in the last slide because it actually paints an interesting picture of where we exist now, with the German building kind of representing the global north and the west, and the Chinese donated building kind of representing what is currently happening on the continent. With the now move in of the East investment and so forth and so forth. But the one major question I have, particularly with the year 2063, is the fact that we're sitting on a time bomb, a population time bomb on the African continent. Mainly because we are the youngest continent currently, and when you look at some of the mechanisms that, say, for instance, China has used to kind of play catch up in global trade and economy, it seems like we're still far off. So what about 2063 has implications on a 22-year-old, a 23-year-old, when they will probably be of an age where they can't even probably participate? Remember, we're also in a context where we have precedents for life. So that's just a provocation for me.
Thanks, and then right at the back there. Okay, we're just trying to get the mic.
Okay, my name is Simpiwe. I'm a cultural activist. I'm not from the university here, but I'm also a student from another university. I cannot agree more than the response that Prof. Ngomezulu gave. I think you helped me in all the list that I have here. But then I have a question on my mind. That is, if you can answer to me that question, that is, will ever Africa be saved? Especially, I would have liked to know maybe when he's guessing, when will that ever happen? That's number one. Number two, I was interested in this Libya story, how it was attacked because it was rich and all. I'm thinking now in my head here, because it was a rich country in Africa. I wanted to know, did the Libya share what it had with other countries in Africa before, just like as a big brother in money? I just wanted to get that thing in my mind. And then the last part, to this lady, Tike lady, because this patriarchal story, I always see it in the Eurocentric way. But in my mind here, I always question myself, but is there no way for people to bring things in an African way? Because I always sense, maybe because of the donor issue, because Prof. Ngomezulu said that when you receive money, either for policies, then the donors always have an interest on that. So unknowingly, so Africa will change and do what the donor wants. So in this case, I wanted to know are there no ways that Africa can be right by really rather looking at how he did things best? Because this last part is very important, because Professor Sesanti always bring that picture very well. That is, in Africa and in its structures, there was no gender oppression and all this thing, or women oppression stuff.
I think we've got your point. So we are completely out of time now, and I want to thank our audience for very interesting questions. It's been a rich discussion so far. So we're going to do 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. I'm going to give our main speaker the benefit of 4 minutes, but our respondents in 2 minutes each. And let's kick off. Dikeledi, you've got a nice juicy question there at the end that I'm sure you want to sink your teeth into. Yes.
Well, in as much as Africa, and I think I share same sentiments with Professor Simpiwe Sasanti. However, we cannot also deny that Africa was colonized, and when it was colonized, when the colonialists arrived and they were like, okay, so whom do we give power politically? Then they decided that the chiefs particularly will be the ones, and predominantly chiefs happen to be male, and that is just disregarding other councils and other forms of organization and decision making polities that existed, right? That also include women and how women organized in that space. So they disregarded all of that, and then they just decided to work and operate with the chiefs. And the chiefs and all the men were very happy to go along, because then that gave them advantage and power. So that is something that we cannot deny. So in that sense, it is African men themselves who contributed to patriarchy manifesting and entrenching itself in the African continent, particularly Eurocentric patriarchy, right? So we've African patriarchy, but now what we've experienced as Africans is basically a conflation of European and African patriarchy. It was like literally two problematic animals, literally operating in one space. So that is something that, with regards to donors, I mean, we can have a conversation about that. I think we know the influence of that, but then ultimately the work of doing the sort of Western-centric degendering that has to happen, including sort of addressing patriarchy, our own African form of patriarchy. So. Yeah, I don't know if there's another thing but we'll have a conversation on.
There will be refreshments afterwards, and then we can have a feisty continuation of this debate. Becky?
Thank you very much, Prof. In the interest of time, I'll confine myself to the two questions asked by Simpiwe. Starting with the second one, did Libya share with other African countries? The answer is an emphatic yes. Libya shared a lot with the African continent, both financially, materially, and militarily. During the liberation struggles across the continent, a number of African cadres were trained in Libya, and some of them were given sanctuary by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, which is partly the reason why he has been hated to the extent that he was eventually eliminated. Even the AU that we're talking about, he contributed a lot financially using oil proceeds. And in fact, if you go to Libya and count the sheikhs, and then come back to Africa, go to Kenya, go to Kibera, just one slum area, and then count the sheikhs there and see if they'll compare with what we have in Libya. So the point is, Muammar Gaddafi did a lot than we have been made to believe. So he has been basically painted negatively, when there are a lot of things that he did, not just for his country, but for the continent as well. Then the last one, will Africa be saved? On this one, let me be an optimist and say yes. But this will not happen automatically. It means a lot of work needs to happen, starting with the question that has been reverberating here about the role of the youth. For as long as we keep elderly people in parliament all by themselves, we have a problem. But then if you have a mixture, what we call intergenerational mix, then we stand a chance. So it means a lot of work needs to happen, and it needs to start now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And over to Ulf.
That's a tricky one. Will the AU get it right at the end of the day? Maybe they have taken all the right decisions, but not every policy is in place. And there's much to be done. Briefly on Ukraine, Russia, and Libya. Of course, Libya contributed 12% to the AU budget, as much as South Africa did. and Brother Leader bankrolled some member states who didn't pay their membership fees. That was because otherwise they couldn't have met in Sirte in 1999. They wouldn't be allowed to take part in that meeting, leading to an interesting debate about the United States of Africa. It's another model of integrating Africa into globalization processes, and it's forgotten that the AU finally decided in 2009 that they want to go for the United States of Africa, to be implemented by 2017. And many people in the AU corridors are quite happy that Gaddafi no longer was around and that that debate stopped there. The decision has not been withdrawn, actually. And the AU was split, both the Commission and member states, in early 2010-11, what to do. There was a case of responsibility to protect that many people in the Commission for Peace and Security made. They were stopped by others. There was a mediation plan. Zuma was about to mediate with Gaddafi. He was not allowed to come in, fly in. I remember colleagues being on standby in Addis to support that, but it didn't happen for the reasons that we know. And basically the AU lost 3 months' time, and then NATO took over and controlled the dynamics. On the question of whether the AU can be a neutral arbitrator in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, no. The AU member states are split. In the 4 important debates in the United Nations, roughly 30 out of 55 member states called it an aggression, a war of aggression. The other half either abstained, didn't take part, or some even voted against resolutions. So there is no unity among member states on that question. And when you remember, or if you remember, the chairperson of the Commission and the chairperson of the AU both went to visit Putin because they wanted to get the wheat exports running, but they haven't been to Ukraine. And they didn't pronounce themselves very clearly on the matter, knowing that member states were split. So I wouldn't expect anything from the AU in that conflict.
Thank you so much. I want to invite everybody for refreshments, but before I do that, I want to invite my colleague Giovanni Poggi to please come here to the front. He is with the Department of History and Political Studies, the co-host of this event with Conrad.
Habari za jioni, colleagues, audience. No, I don't speak Swahili. I was just trying to be a little bit more Pan-African. I'll try to keep this brief because I know I stand between you and the refreshments. And my grandmother used to say, hungry minds can't learn. So I don't know why we didn't eat before. But so I was asked to plug the department quickly. But I don't think I actually need to do that because there were so many of our great students here representing our department today asking such awesome questions. But in terms of a quick plug, I think what I would like to do is just refer you back to one of my honors students at the back there, Zukisa, who asked a question earlier in the session. Zukisa is also on the committee of the UNASA, United Nations Association of South Africa's student chapter at Mandela University, and they're trying to get the society back on the go this year. I actually have some of his membership forms down here, so if you would like to join the UN Society, because I think this is an apt time to talk about something like this, then please do talk to him after the session and grab a membership form from me. Okay, so my HOD is an acting HOD, so I think I'm probably then a supporting actor HOD today, but just on behalf of our acting HOD, Prof. Breakfast, and the Department of History and Political Studies, we'd like to firstly thank Conrad for the opportunity once again to co-host this excellent and timely seminar. And then I just have a quick list here to go through. So just to thank, of course, Prof. Ulf Engel for his contributions, Prof. Beki Ngomezulu, soon to be Dr. Dikeledi Mokoena, as well as Prof. Breakfast, Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Lutz, Dr. Akingbade, Ms. Scott, Mr. Fabry, and Mr. Mabena for the tech support. and obviously Prof. van der Westhuizen for overseeing the execution of this wonderful event. So with that, I say hamba kakuhle and kwaheri. Enjoy the refreshments.